The lawyer's hands trembled as he reached for the second envelope, the one nobody knew existed. I watched Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers freeze mid-air, her champagne glass suspended in what had been, just moments before, her victory toast. The laughter that had echoed through Grandma Evelyn's old wooden house when my name wasn't mentioned in the will still hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. "There's another document," Mr. Harold Green said, his voice cutting through the self-congratulatory murmurs of my family. His weathered brown fingers, steady despite their tremor, pulled out a cream-colored envelope with my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting scrawled across it. To be opened after the first reading. I stood in the corner where I'd been standing for the past hour. Invisible, as always. The same corner where I'd stood at family dinners, Christmas gatherings, and every other occasion where the Johnson family assembled to remind me, without words, that I didn't quite belong. My skin was too dark. My hair was too natural. My opinions were too different. My very existence seemed to be an inconvenience they tolerated out of obligation. Vanessa had received the house. This very house where Grandma had taught me to sew, where she'd whispered stories of resistance and resilience, while her nimble fingers worked miracles with fabric and thread. My cousin Marcus got the vintage car Grandpa had restored. Aunt Diane received the jewelry. Uncle James inherited the modest investment portfolio. Even my mother, who'd barely visited in the last 5 years, received a substantial cash sum. And me? Nothing. Not even a mention. Not even one of Grandma's colorful head wraps or her old sewing machine. The one I'd learned on. The one that had taught my hands to create beauty from scraps. "Well, go on then," Vanessa had laughed, settling into Grandma's favorite chair like a queen claiming her throne. "Let's see what little trinket she left for poor Aisha. Maybe her old apron." The room had erupted in laughter. My mother's eyes had found the floor. But now, the laughter had died. Mr. Green's expression was unreadable, carved from stone and righteousness. He'd been Grandma's lawyer for 30 years, her friend for longer. He knew things. He kept secrets. And as he began to unfold the letter inside that second envelope, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked like vindication. "This letter," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "was written by Mrs. Evelyn Mae Johnson 3 months before her passing. She was quite specific about when it should be read." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on me. She was even more specific about why. My heart hammered against my ribs. Vanessa's smile had frozen into something grotesque. The room had gone so quiet, I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked the hours of my childhood summers, when this house had been my sanctuary, and Grandma Evelyn had been the only person who truly saw me. Mr. Green cleared his throat and began to read. "To my family gathered here today, I hope you enjoyed your inheritance. You've earned it with your visits and your phone calls, and your concern, especially in these last years when death was coming, and you all suddenly remembered I existed. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. But there's one person who never forgot me. Not when it was convenient. Not when there was something to gain. There's one person who saw me as Evelyn, not as grandmother with assets. And it's time you all knew the truth about what real love looks like." Before we continue with what happened next, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. I hadn't wanted to come back to Savannah. The call had come at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, my mother's voice small and fractured on the other end of the line, barely able to form the words. "She's gone. Aisha, Mama's gone." Even in death, even in that moment of shared grief, I could hear the distance in her voice. Not emotional distance. We'd both loved Grandma Evelyn fiercely, in our own ways. But the distance that had always existed between my mother and me, a chasm built from years of her choosing family peace over defending her daughter. I'd driven through the night from Atlanta, where I'd built a life that finally felt like mine. A small apartment with plants in the windows. A job at a nonprofit that mattered. Friends who saw me, really saw me, without the weight of family politics distorting their vision. I'd created distance deliberately, visited Savannah only when absolutely necessary. And even then, I stayed in hotels rather than subject myself to the subtle cruelties of family gatherings. But Grandma's house, that was different. Even as I turned onto Whitaker Street at dawn, watching the Spanish moss sway from the live oaks in the early light, I felt the pull of it. The house stood just as I remembered, a modest shotgun-style home painted a fading yellow, with a wide porch where Grandma used to sit in her rocking chair, watching the neighborhood wake up. Her flower boxes still burst with marigolds and petunias. Someone had been watering them, probably Mrs. Chen from next door, who'd been Grandma's friend for 40 years. The front door was unlocked. It always was during the day. Grandma's small rebellion against a world that had tried to make her afraid. "I survived Jim Crow," she used to say. "I'm not about to let fear rule me now." Inside, the house smelled like her. Lavender sachets, old books, and the faint ghost of whatever she'd been cooking. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains she'd made herself, casting patterns on the worn wooden floors. Everything was exactly as I remembered, except for the silence, the terrible, absolute silence where her voice should have been. I found my mother in the kitchen, sitting at the yellow formica table that had been there since the 70s. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by grief or guilt, or the weight of being the one who'd had to make the funeral arrangements. Her eyes were swollen, her church clothes already laid out on the back of the chair, a black dress with a respectful hemline, pearls that had been a gift from Grandma decades ago. "Aisha." She stood, and for a moment I thought she might hug me. Instead, she smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture I'd seen 1,000 times. "I'm glad you're here. She's been handling most of the arrangements. You know how she is. Efficient." What I knew was that Vanessa saw Grandma's death as an opportunity. She'd swooped in during the last 2 years of Grandma's life, suddenly devoted, suddenly concerned, after decades of sporadic visits and forgotten birthdays. She'd moved into the guest room, claimed she was caring for Grandma, though I knew from my weekly phone calls with my grandmother that Vanessa spent most of her time on her laptop, working her real estate deals, using Grandma's address for the prestige of the historic district. "Where is everyone?" I asked, setting my overnight bag by the door. "Vanessa's at the funeral home, finalizing things. The service is tomorrow at Mother Bethel AME. Your cousins will be here tonight. Aunt Diane and Uncle James are flying in this afternoon." She paused, her fingers worrying the edge of her sleeve. "Your grandmother." She was very specific about her arrangements. She planned everything, even picked out her dress, the purple one with the gold embroidery she made for your graduation. My throat tightened. I remembered that dress. Grandma had worked on it for months, her arthritic fingers moving slowly but surely, creating something beautiful because she knew I'd loved purple since I was a child. She'd worn it to my college graduation, standing in the crowd with such pride that I'd felt seen in a way I'd never felt with the rest of the family. "Can I see her room?" I asked. My mother's face shifted, something between permission and warning. Vanessa moved most of her things already. "For safekeeping," she said. "But yes, go ahead." I climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, my hand trailing along the banister that Grandma had polished weekly for 60 years. Her room was at the end of the hall, door half open, afternoon light streaming through the window that overlooked the garden she'd tended with such care. The room had been stripped, not completely. The furniture was still there, the bed with its wedding ring quilt, the dresser with the oval mirror. But the personal things were gone. The photographs that had covered every surface, the head wraps draped over the chair, the Bible with her handwritten notes in the margins, the sewing basket that was never far from her reach. Vanessa had already begun the erasure. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the loss of her like a physical wound. This was the room where I'd spent countless summer nights, sleeping on a pallet on the floor while Grandma told me stories. Stories about her mother, who'd been born just after the Civil War. Stories about surviving segregation, about dignity in the face of degradation, about building something from nothing, because that's what Johnson women did. "You different, baby," she'd told me once, her hand gentle on my natural hair, which the family constantly criticized. "Different don't mean wrong. Different means you got your own truth to tell. Don't let them make you small to fit their comfort." A sound from downstairs pulled me back. Voices, the front door opening, Vanessa's distinctive laugh, bright and proprietary. I heard her saying something about the house's value, about the market, about timing. I stood and looked at myself in Grandma's mirror. 32 years old, dressed in jeans and a simple black shirt, my locks pulled back from my face. I looked tired. I looked like I'd been crying. But more than that, I looked like Grandma. We had the same eyes, the same set to our jaw, the same refusal to bend that showed in the straight line of our backs. "God, don't sleep, baby," she used to say. I didn't know what she meant then, but I was about to find out. The funeral was everything Grandma Evelyn would have hated and everything the family needed to feel important. Mother Bethel. AME Church was packed, 300 people crammed into pews that had held generations of Savannah's Black community. The choir sang Precious Lord with such passion that even people who'd barely known Grandma wept. Pastor Williams delivered a eulogy that painted her as a saint, a pillar of the community, a woman of unwavering faith. All true, but missing the edges of her, the sharp wit, the quiet rebellion, the way she could cut you down with a look when you were being foolish. I sat in the front pew between my mother and an aunt I barely recognized, watching Vanessa dab at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She'd positioned herself as the chief mourner, greeting people as they entered, accepting condolences as if she were the sole inheritor of Grandma's legacy. She wore black Chanel, inappropriate for a Baptist funeral in Savannah, but perfectly on brand for Vanessa, who'd always valued appearance over authenticity. As the service droned on, I let my mind drift back to the summers that had shaped me. I was 7 the first time my mother dropped me at Grandma's house for the summer. "She needs straightening out," my mother had said, as if I were a bent nail. The truth was simpler and more painful. I didn't fit the mold of what a Johnson girl should be, and my mother didn't know what to do with me. But Grandma did. That first morning, she'd taken me into her sewing room, a converted sun porch filled with fabric bolts, a vintage Singer machine, and enough thread to stitch together 1,000 dreams. The room smelled like cotton and possibility. "You know why I sew, baby?" she'd asked, threading a needle with practiced ease despite her age. I'd shaken my head, small hands folded in my lap. Because when the world tries to tell you what shape you gotta be, sewing lets you make your own pattern. You take the fabric you got, and you create something that fits you, not what somebody else thinks you should wear. She'd handed me a scrap of bright African print fabric. "Now you tell me, what do you want to make?" That summer, she taught me to sew, but more than that, she taught me to trust my own vision. While the rest of the family criticized my dark skin, my kinky hair, my tendency to ask questions nobody wanted to answer, Grandma celebrated every part of me. She taught me to braid my own hair, oil my own skin, stand in my own truth. She taught me about the women who came before us. Great-great-grandmother Hannah, who'd escaped slavery and walked 200 miles to freedom. Great-grandmother Ruth, who'd opened the first Black-owned laundromat in Savannah. Grandmother Evelyn herself, who'd built a fabric business during the 1970s when banks wouldn't give Black women loans. "We are legacy makers," she'd said, her hand steady on the fabric. "Every stitch is an act of resistance. Every creation is proof that we were here, that we mattered, that we refused to disappear." I came back every summer until I was 17. Those months were my salvation, a space where I could breathe, where I wasn't constantly monitored and judged, where my grandmother's love was steady and unconditional. We'd spend mornings in the sewing room, afternoons in her garden, evenings on the porch watching neighbors pass by. She knew everyone, called them by name, knew their stories, their struggles, their victories, but the rest of the family saw her differently. To them, she was the matriarch, the one who held the purse strings, the property owner whose modest wealth represented security. Especially after Grandpa died 15 years ago, leaving her the house free and clear, plus the small commercial property where her fabric shop had been. Nothing extravagant, but in a rapidly gentrifying Savannah, those properties were worth something. I watched the shift happen gradually. Cousins who'd barely visited started showing up regularly. Aunt Diane, who'd moved to Charleston and rarely called, suddenly remembered every holiday. Uncle James, who'd always thought Grandma was too old-fashioned, started seeking her advice. And Vanessa, ambitious, calculating Vanessa, positioned herself as the devoted granddaughter, the one who'd sacrifice her own life to care for Grandma in her final years. I'd called Grandma every week from Atlanta. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, about the nonprofit where I worked helping at-risk youth, about her garden, about the neighborhood changes, about life. Never about the family drama, though I knew she was aware of it. She had a way of knowing things without being told. "How's Vanessa treating you?" I'd asked during one call about a year before she died. There was a long pause. Then, "Baby, people show you who they are if you watch close enough. Your cousin is ambitious, and that's not bad. But ambition without love is just greed wearing a fancy hat. Do you want me to come down? I can take time off." "No, sugar. You live your life. You earned that peace you got in Atlanta. Don't let guilt pull you back into something that's not yours to fix." Another pause. "But Aisha, I want you to know something. You're the one who got it right. You're the one who understood what I was trying to teach all these years. The others, they learned the wrong lessons." I didn't understand what she meant then. Sitting in that church pew, watching my family perform grief like a stage production, I was beginning to. The repast was held at the church fellowship hall. Fried chicken, collard greens, mac and cheese, sweet tea, and enough desserts to feed the entire congregation. People I didn't know offered condolences. Old church mothers hugged me and called me baby. Mrs. Chen from next door held my hand and told me Grandma had talked about me constantly. She was so proud of you. Said you were the only one who inherited her spirit. Vanessa worked the room like a politician, gracious and charming, occasionally shooting me looks that were equal parts pity and contempt. My mother stayed close to Aunt Diane, the two of them whispering in corners. My cousins Marcus and Shauna clustered by the dessert table, looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes, eager to change and escape to whatever lives they'd built away from Savannah. I found myself outside on the church steps as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple, Grandma's favorite colors. Mr. Harold Green, the family lawyer, stood a few feet away, smoking a cigarette with the guilty air of a man who knows it's bad for him but doesn't care. "Miss Aisha," he said, nodding, "your grandmother was a remarkable woman." Yes, she was. He took a long drag, exhaling slowly. "She talked about you often, especially toward the end." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. He was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read, assessment mixed with something like anticipation. "The will reading is tomorrow," he continued. 2:00 at the house. I trust you'll be there?" "Of course." He nodded again, dropped his cigarette, and ground it out with his shoe. "Good, that's very good." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Miss Aisha, your grandmother was many things, faithful, strong, wise. But she was also strategic. She understood timing. She understood that the truth has its own season." Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared back into the fellowship hall, leaving me alone with the sunset and a growing sense that tomorrow's will reading was going to be nothing like the family expected. The house was full by 1:30 the next afternoon. Family members scattered across Grandma's living room like pieces on a chessboard, each one calculating their position, their worth, their claim to her legacy. I'd arrived early, hoping for a few quiet moments in the house before the vultures descended. Instead, I found Vanessa already there, directing two men who were measuring the living room windows. She'd changed from her funeral blacks into cream linen pants and a silk blouse, casual elegance that screamed money and taste. "Aisha," she said, barely glancing up from her phone. "I'm just getting estimates for updates. The house needs so much work. New windows, updated kitchen, refinished floors. The bones are good, but it needs a complete renovation to maximize value." "Maximize value," I repeated, my voice flat. "Well, yes." Now she looked at me, her expression patient in the way people are patient with children who don't understand adult matters. "Grandma would want us to be smart about this. The market in the historic district is booming. With the right updates, this property could sell for $800,000, maybe more. Of course, we'll have to split it among the family, but still, it's a substantial sum." She'd already spent the inheritance in her mind, already calculated her portion, already planned how to divide up our grandmother's life like it was nothing more than a real estate transaction. She's been dead 3 days. Vanessa, and I loved her. Vanessa's voice sharpened. Don't you dare suggest otherwise. I was here, Aisha. For 2 years I was here, making sure she took her medications, driving her to doctor's appointments, keeping her company. Where were you? Oh, that's right. In Atlanta, living your life, calling once a week like that was enough. The words hit like slaps, each one designed to wound, and they did, because there was truth in them. I had stayed away. I had built a life elsewhere, but I'd stayed away because being around this family felt like drowning, and Grandma had understood that. She'd encouraged it. Before I could respond, the house began to fill. Uncle James arrived with Aunt Diane, both of them dressed like they were attending a business meeting. Cousins Marcus and Shauna came together, Marcus in a wrinkled suit, Shauna checking her phone every 30 seconds. My mother was the last to arrive, her face carefully neutral, her hands clutching her purse like a life raft. Mr. Green appeared at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked older than I was. He'd changed from his funeral suit into a brown suit that had seen better days, but he wore it with the dignity of a man who'd earned his place in the world through integrity rather than flash. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into the chair at the head of Grandma's dining table. "I know this is difficult, but Mrs. Johnson was very specific about her wishes, and I intend to honor them exactly as she directed." Vanessa claimed the seat closest to him, her posture perfect, her expression appropriately somber, but with an edge of anticipation she couldn't quite hide. The rest of the family arranged themselves around the table, a tableau of greed and grief, hope and hypocrisy. I stayed in the doorway, leaning against the frame, half in the room and half out, the way I'd always been with this family. Mr. Green opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick document. "This is the last will and testament of Evelyn Mae Johnson, executed 6 months before her death and updated 3 months later with a codicil." He paused, looking around the table. "Before I begin, I want to be clear. This document was prepared by Mrs. Johnson with full mental capacity. She was sharp as a tack until the very end, and she knew exactly what she was doing." "Of course she did," Vanessa said smoothly. "Grandma was always so organized." Mr. Green's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He began to read in a measured voice, going through the legal preamble, the appointment of executor, the payment of debts and expenses. Then he got to the specific bequests. "To my son James, I leave the sum of $20,000 and my late husband's restored 1967 Chevrolet Impala." Uncle James nodded, satisfied. "To my daughter Diane, I leave my jewelry collection, appraised at approximately $15,000, and the sum of $20,000. Aunt Diane smiled. "To my grandson Marcus, I leave the sum of $10,000. Marcus straightened in his chair, pleased. "To my granddaughter Shauna, I leave the sum of $10,000 and my collection of first edition books." Shauna actually looked up from her phone. "To my daughter Carolyn." Mr. Green glanced at my mother. "I leave the sum of $50,000, with the stipulation that it be used for her own needs and not dispersed to other family members." My mother's eyes filled with tears. She nodded silently. "And finally, to my granddaughter Vanessa Carter, I leave this house and all its contents, with the exception of items specifically bequeathed to others." The room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Vanessa's face transformed, triumph mixed with validation, the smile of someone who'd always known they deserved everything and had now been proven right. "Of course," she said, reaching across to squeeze Mr. Green's hand. "Grandma knew. She knew who really took care of her." The words hung in the air, and every single person in that room turned to look at me, not with sympathy, with something worse. Satisfaction, vindication, the unspoken message. "See? Even your grandmother knew you didn't measure up." My mother's eyes found the floor. Uncle James and Aunt Diane exchanged knowing glances. Marcus and Shauna looked uncomfortable but unsurprised. And Vanessa was already standing, already walking around the room like she owned it, which apparently she did. "Well," she said, her voice bright with false generosity, "this is overwhelming, But I promise I'll honor Grandma's memory in everything I do with this house. It will be a show place. She'd want that. Actually, Mr. Green said quietly, and the single word cut through the noise like a knife through silk. I'm not finished. The room went silent. Vanessa froze mid-gesture. What do you mean? You just read the bequests. I read the first will. He reached into his briefcase again, this time withdrawing a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Grandma's, elegant script in deep purple ink. To be opened after the first reading. My heart stopped. Mr. Green held the envelope up, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Johnson left explicit instructions. This envelope was to be sealed in my office safe and opened only after the initial will was read in full, and all parties had the opportunity to react. React? Vanessa's voice had gone sharp. What kind of game is this? No game, Miss Carter. Just your grandmother's final wishes, exactly as she expressed them. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on me for just a moment longer than the others. Shall I continue? Nobody spoke. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked into the silence. Outside, a car passed by, its radio playing something cheerful and distant. Inside Grandma's house, the air had gone thick with tension and confusion, and the first whispers of dread. Mr. Green carefully opened the envelope and withdrew several sheets of paper, some legal documents, and one that looked like a letter in Grandma's own handwriting. Before I read this, he said, I want you all to know that I tried to talk Mrs. Johnson out of this approach. I told her it might cause unnecessary drama, that there were simpler ways to handle her affairs. But she insisted. She said, and I quote, Harold, they need to show themselves first. They need to reveal who they really are when they think nobody's watching, and then they need to face the truth. Vanessa had gone pale. My mother gripped the edge of the table, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but wait for what came next. Mr. Green adjusted his reading glasses, the gesture maddeningly slow. The silence in the room had texture now, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like humidity before a storm. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. This letter, he began, was written by Mrs. Evelyn Mae Johnson on March 15th of this year, 3 months before her passing. I witnessed it myself, along with Dr. Patricia Mills and Reverend Thomas from Mother Bethel. All can attest that Mrs. Johnson was of sound mind and clear purpose. Just read it, Vanessa snapped, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Mr. Green's eyes lifted from the paper, fixing on her with a look that could have frozen fire. I will read it exactly as Mrs. Johnson intended, Miss Carter, at the pace she would have wanted. She was never one to be rushed, especially not in her own home. The rebuke landed like a physical blow. Vanessa's mouth snapped shut. The letter begins, To my family gathered here today. Mr. Green's voice took on a different quality now, and I realized he was reading in Grandma's cadence, with her rhythm, as if channeling her spirit into the room. I hope you enjoyed your inheritance. You've earned it with your visits and your phone calls and your concern, especially in these last years when death was coming, and you all suddenly remembered I existed. The temperature dropped. I watched my uncle's face go rigid, my aunt's hand flutter to her throat. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. My mother's tears started fresh, but these were different. These were tears of recognition, of shame. Now, before you get too comfortable, Mr. Green continued, I want to tell you a story. When I was 9 years old, my mama sat me down and taught me how to read people. She said, Evelyn Mae, the world's gonna try to fool you every day. Folks gonna smile to your face and curse you behind your back. They gonna want what you got without wanting to know who you are. So you watch. You watch how people move when they think nobody's looking. You watch what they do when there's nothing in it for them. That's when you see the truth. I remembered Grandma saying those same words to me, sitting on her porch in the golden hour of evening, watching the neighborhood move around us. She'd pointed to Mrs. Chen watering her garden, to Mr. Washington helping his elderly neighbor carry groceries, to the young couple down the street working together to paint their porch. See that? She'd said. That's real. That's people showing you who they are. So I watched, Mr. Green read on. For the last 2 years of my life, after the doctors told me the cancer was back and this time it was winning, I watched my family very carefully. I watched who came to visit and why. I watched who called and what they asked about. I watched who looked at me and who looked at my house, my things, my assets. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to flushed. This is ridiculous. I cared for her. I gave up 2 years of my life. Please don't interrupt, Mr. Green said, his voice mild but firm. Mrs. Johnson anticipated objections. He returned to the letter. My granddaughter Vanessa will probably object right about here. She'll talk about sacrifice and caregiving and devotion, so let me address that directly. Vanessa, honey, you moved into my house because your condo was in foreclosure and you needed a place to stay rent-free while you rebuilt your real estate business. You took the guest room and turned it into an office. You used my address on your business cards because properties in the historic district carry weight with clients. You drove me to doctor's appointments when it fit your schedule, but Mrs. Chen was the one who sat with me during the long afternoons, when I couldn't remember if I'd taken my pills. You made sure I was alive, but you never once asked me how I was living. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, each one creating ripples that spread and intersected. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her carefully constructed image was cracking, and everyone could see the fissures. James, the letter continued, you called every month like clockwork after the diagnosis. Asked about my health, about my comfort, about my plans. You never asked about my fear or my memories or what I needed to say before I died. And Diane, sweet Diane, you flew down from Charleston 4 times in 2 years. Each visit you took inventory. I saw you looking at the jewelry, touching the furniture, calculating. You thought you were subtle, but baby, I raised you. I know your tells. Aunt Diane made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Uncle James had gone stone-faced, the look of a man realizing he'd been seen and found wanting. Marcus and Shauna. Mr. Green read, and both cousins flinched. You're young enough that I can forgive you for being more interested in your inheritance than your grandmother. You came when your parents made you come. You were polite and respectful, which is more than some managed. You'll do better as you get older. Take the money and learn from it. There was mercy in those words, I realized. Grandma had always been able to distinguish between malice and immaturity, between intentional cruelty and thoughtless youth. Carolyn, Mr. Green's voice softened, and I saw my mother brace herself. My daughter, my complicated, conflicted, careful daughter, you loved me. I never doubted that, but you loved peace more. You loved family harmony more. You loved not making waves more. When your brothers and sister criticized your daughter, my granddaughter Aisha, for being too dark, too natural, too different, you said nothing. When they mocked her, you looked away. When they made her feel invisible in her own family, you chose silence. The money I'm leaving you comes with a prayer that you'll find the courage to defend what's right instead of what's easy. My mother was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to go to her, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching my family's carefully maintained facades crumble one by one. Mr. Green paused, took a sip of water from the glass someone had placed at his elbow hours ago. His hand was steadier now, as if the act of reading this letter was giving him strength rather than draining it. Now, he continued, we come to the interesting part. The part where I explain why I structured my will the way I did. You see, I needed to know what you'd all do if you thought Aisha got nothing. I needed to watch your faces, hear your laughter, see your relief that the strange one, the different one, the one who never quite fit in. I needed to see your reaction when you thought she'd been excluded. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, could hear the soft tick of the grandfather clock marking the seconds of this impossible moment. And you showed me exactly what I needed to see, the letter said. You laughed. You felt vindicated. Some of you felt sorry for her. But none of you, not one single person in this room except Aisha herself, questioned whether it was right, whether it was fair, whether it was true to who I was. You accepted it because it confirmed what you already believed, that Aisha wasn't really one of you, wasn't really worth the same consideration. I could feel every eye in the room on me now, but I couldn't look at any of them. My vision had narrowed to Mr. Green's hands holding those pages, to Grandma's handwriting visible at the edges, to the truth spilling out in words she'd written months ago, knowing she wouldn't be here to speak them herself. "So here's what's going to happen now," Mr. Green read, and his voice had taken on a note of something like satisfaction. "Mr. Green is going to explain the real terms of my will. The terms I actually meant. The terms that reflect who I really was and what I really valued. And all of you are going to sit there and listen. And then you're going to have to live with what you learn about yourselves today." He set down the first page and picked up the second. Legal language now, dense and formal, but with Grandma's intentions crystal clear beneath the legalese. The initial will reading was a test, Mr. Green said, his lawyer voice returning. "Every bequest I just read stands as stated, with one significant exception, the house and its contents." Vanessa made a sound like she'd been punched. "The property located at 412 Whitaker Street, Savannah, Georgia, including the house, the land, and all contents thereof, with the exception of items already specifically bequeathed, is hereby left in its entirety to my granddaughter, Aisha Marie Johnson." The world tilted. I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. Mr. Green's voice continued, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted. "Additionally, the commercial property at 89 Broughton Street, currently leased to Savannah Arts Collective, is also bequeathed to Aisha Marie Johnson, along with all income derived from said property. Furthermore, the trust account established in 1985, currently valued at approximately $370,000, is to be transferred to Miss Johnson upon the settlement of this estate." "No." Vanessa was on her feet, her chair clattering backward. "No, this is insane. This is fraud. You can't." She whirled on me, her face contorted with rage. "You did this. You manipulated her. You poisoned her against her own family." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, my mind reeling from the impossibility of what I'd just heard. The house, the building where Grandma's fabric shop had been, a trust account I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was everything. It was Grandma's entire legacy, built from decades of work and sacrifice and determination. "Miss Carter, please sit down," Mr. Green said, his voice sharp now. "I have 30 years of documentation proving Mrs. Johnson's mental competency and the validity of this will." 3 doctors examined her. 2 ministers witnessed it. Everything was done according to Georgia state law, and I guarantee you that any legal challenge will fail and will only cost you money you've just inherited. "But why?" Uncle James demanded, also standing. "Why would she do this? Aisha wasn't even here. She barely visited. It's a betrayal of the whole family." Mr. Green picked up the letter again. "They'll ask why," he read. "So let me tell them, Aisha was the only one who never wanted anything from me except my time. She called every week for 25 years, and not once did she ask about my will, my property, my plans. She visited when she could, and when she couldn't, she was honest about why. She never pretended, never performed, never calculated. She loved me because of who I was, not what I had. And more than that, she understood what I was trying to teach." Mr. Green looked up at me then, his eyes shining. "Aisha learned to sew, but more importantly, she learned why I sewed. She understood that every stitch was an act of resistance. That creation in the face of a world that wants to destroy you is the deepest form of dignity. She carried forward the lessons of the women who came before us. She made herself when the world tried to break her. She stayed true when everyone else bent toward convenience." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't even try to stop them. "This house," the letter continued, "is not just property. It's history. It's the place where I raised my children during integration, where I built a business when banks wouldn't loan to Black women, where I taught my granddaughter that she was enough exactly as she was. This house is a legacy, and legacies should go to people who understand what they mean. Aisha understands. The rest of you just saw real estate." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't anticipation or tension. This was the aftermath of an explosion, the stunned quiet of people realizing that everything they thought they knew was wrong. "The letter concludes," Mr. Green said softly. "Aisha, baby, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this before I left. I'm sorry you had to sit through that first reading and feel forgotten, But I needed them to show themselves. I needed you to see, once and for all, that the problem was never you. It was never that you weren't enough. It was that they couldn't see what enough looked like when it was standing right in front of them. Take this house. Take this legacy. Fill it with the love and truth and resistance that our people have always needed. And remember what I always told you. God don't sleep, baby. Justice has its own timing, and truth has its own season. This is yours. You earned it by being exactly who you are. Mr. Green carefully folded the letter and placed it in a new envelope, this one with my name on it. He stood and walked across the room, his footsteps loud in the absolute silence, and placed it in my shaking hands. "Miss Johnson," he said formally, but his eyes were warm. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this when the reading was complete. She also asked me to tell you that she was prouder of you than of anything else she ever created." I clutched the letter to my chest, and finally, I let myself look at my family. Nobody moved for what felt like an eternity. We were frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Vanessa standing with her hands clenched at her sides, Uncle James halfway out of his chair, Aunt Diane with her hand pressed to her mouth, my mother weeping silently, Marcus and Shauna staring at their phones like they might find some escape route in their screens. And me, standing in the doorway with my grandmother's final letter pressed against my heart, feeling the weight of her love and her legacy settling onto my shoulders like a mantle I'd never expected to wear. Vanessa was the first to break. "This is bullshit." Her voice cracked on the word, all her careful elegance stripped away. 2 years. 2 years I spent in this house, taking care of her, managing her life, making sure she was comfortable. And this is what I get? Cast aside for someone who couldn't even be bothered to visit? "Miss Carter," Mr. Green began, but she cut him off. Don't you dare defend this. You know what she did? She manipulated a dying old woman. She probably called every day, filling her head with lies about us, making herself look like some kind of saint while we were actually here, actually doing the work. "Vanessa, stop." My mother's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tirade like a blade. She'd stood up, wiping her face, and there was something different in her expression now, something raw and honest that I'd rarely seen. "Just stop. Mom, you can't possibly think this is fair." "Fair?" My mother's laugh was bitter. "You want to talk about fair? Aisha was 7 years old the first time I heard you tell her she was too dark to be pretty. She was 12 when you said her natural hair made her look uncivilized. She was 16 when you told her she'd never amount to anything because she was too different. And I said nothing. I stood by and said nothing because I wanted peace, because I wanted everyone to get along, because I was a coward." The room had gone deathly still again. My mother was looking at me now, her eyes red but clear. Mama saw what I was too afraid to see. She saw that I chose comfort over my daughter. And she made sure that Aisha got what she deserved, what I should have fought to give her all along. Recognition, protection, love without conditions. She turned to Vanessa. "You moved in here because you needed a place to stay. You know it, I know it, and Mama knew it. You got exactly what you earned. A roof over your head when you needed it, and a modest inheritance. Aisha got what love deserves. Carol," Aunt Diane started, but my mother shook her head. "No, Diane, we're done pretending. We're done acting like this family treated Aisha with anything approaching fairness. She was different, and we punished her for it. Every gathering, every holiday, every phone call, we made her feel like she had to apologize for existing. And the only person who stood up for her was Mama." Uncle James cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "This is all very emotional, but the fact remains that this will is highly unusual. Bypassing the immediate family, creating this theatrical reading, it seems designed to cause conflict. It was designed to reveal truth," Mr. Green said quietly. "Mrs. Johnson was very clear about her intentions. She wanted her family to confront what they'd become, what they'd done. And she wanted to ensure that her legacy went to someone who would honor it." "Honor it?" Vanessa's voice dripped with contempt. "She'll probably sell it in 6 months. Cash out and run back to Atlanta with her pockets full. At least I would have preserved it, maintained it as a family home." "You would have renovated it and sold it for maximum profit," I said, speaking for the first time since the second envelope was opened. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steadier than I felt, harder than I usually allowed myself to be. I heard you on the phone yesterday, Vanessa, talking to a developer about unlocking the property's full potential. You were already planning the sale before Grandma was even in the ground. She flinched but recovered quickly. I was exploring options. That's smart financial planning, not betrayal. And that's the difference. I pushed off from the doorframe, moving into the room fully for the first time. To you, this is financial planning. To me, this is Grandma's life. This is where she sat every morning drinking coffee and watching the sun come up. This is where she taught me that my black skin was beautiful, that my natural hair was a crown, that being different was a strength, not a weakness. This is where she survived and thrived and built something meaningful. This isn't real estate to me, Vanessa. This is sacred ground. Oh, please. But her voice had lost its conviction. You're going to stand there and act like you're some kind of keeper of Grandma's legacy? You barely knew her in the last few years. I talked to her every Sunday at 9 a.m. for 25 years, I said, and my voice was shaking now, but not with weakness, with fury. Every single Sunday. When she had the first cancer scare 15 years ago, I drove down every weekend for 6 months. When Grandpa died, I took a leave of absence from work and stayed here for 2 months, helping her grieve, helping her figure out how to live alone. When she fell and broke her hip 8 years ago, I was the one who researched physical therapists and set up her home care. I knew her, Vanessa. I knew her favorite hymn and her secret recipe for peach cobbler and the name of her first-grade teacher and the story of how she got her sewing machine. I knew her because I wanted to, not because I needed something from her. The words poured out like water from a broken dam. Years of hurt and invisibility and feeling like I had to defend my worth to people who'd decided long ago that I wasn't worth defending. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Look, I think we're all just in shock. This is a lot to process. Maybe we should take a break, come back to this when everyone's calmer. No. Mr. Green's voice was firm. We finish this now as Mrs. Johnson wanted. There are still practicalities to address. He turned to me. Miss Johnson, the property transfers will take approximately 60 days to complete. In the interim, you have full legal rights to the house as of this moment. Anyone residing here does so at your discretion. The implication was clear. Vanessa paled. You can't possibly expect me to just... I have nowhere else to go right now. I gave up my apartment. You gave up an apartment you couldn't afford, I said quietly. And you used Grandma's kindness to solve your financial problems. I'm not going to throw you out, Vanessa, but you need to start looking for your own place. You have 60 days. How generous, she spat. It's more than generous, Mr. Green interjected. Miss Johnson could legally have you removed immediately, but she's choosing to give you time. I suggest you accept gracefully. Vanessa grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. This isn't over. I'm going to contest this will. I'm going to fight it with every resource I have. And when I win, and I will win, you're going to regret this. You won't win, Mr. Green said matter-of-factly, but you're welcome to try. My firm will vigorously defend Mrs. Johnson's clearly stated wishes, and Miss Johnson will not pay a penny of your legal fees when you lose. Vanessa looked around the room, seeking allies, but found none. Even Aunt Diane and Uncle James wouldn't meet her eyes. She'd overplayed her hand, revealed too much of her calculation and greed, and now she stood alone in her fury. Fine. She headed for the door, then stopped and turned back to me. You know what the saddest part is? I actually did love her. Maybe not the way you did, maybe not as purely, but I loved her. And it still wasn't enough because I wasn't you. Because I didn't fit some idealized version she had in her head. That's not fair either, Aisha. That's not justice. That's just preference. For a moment, I saw past her anger to the hurt beneath it. For a moment, she was just my cousin, complicated and flawed and human. Maybe you're right, I said softly. Maybe it's not fair. But Grandma didn't owe anyone fairness. She didn't owe anyone her life's work. What she gave freely, to the person she thought would honor it best. That's not preference, that's discernment. Vanessa left without another word, the screen door slamming behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a final punctuation mark. One by one, the others filed out. Uncle James and Aunt Diane left quickly, uncomfortably, already calculating how to maintain their inheritances while distancing themselves from the drama. Marcus and Shauna mumbled awkward congratulations and fled to their respective lives. Mr. Green packed up his briefcase, handed me his card, and told me to call him when I was ready to discuss the practicalities of the estate. And then it was just my mother and me, standing in Grandma's living room, the afternoon light slanting through the lace curtains she'd made decades ago. "I'm sorry," my mother said finally. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it's decades too late, but I need you to hear it. I am so sorry." I looked at her, this woman who'd given me life but hadn't quite known how to protect it. "I know, Mom. Are you going to move back? To Savannah?" The question hung in the air. I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe I'll keep it as it is, visit when I can. I have a life in Atlanta. You could have both," she said. Mama did. She had roots here and branches everywhere. She picked up her purse, hesitated, then pulled me into a hug, brief and awkward, but genuine. "Whatever you decide, I hope you'll let me be part of it. I hope you'll give me a chance to do better, to be better. Mom," my voice caught. "You don't have to answer now, just think about it." She pulled back, wiped her eyes. "I should go. But Aisha, she was right. She was right about everything. You were always enough. More than enough. You were exactly what she hoped you'd be." When she left, I was finally alone in the house that was now mine. I walked through it slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the door frames. In the kitchen, I found Grandma's handwritten recipe cards in her precise script. In the living room, the quilt she'd been working on before she got too sick. A pattern of interlocking circles she'd called generations. In her bedroom, I found her collection of head wraps still draped over the chair. Waiting, and in the sewing room, my sewing room now, I found a note taped to the old Singer machine. "Keep stitching, baby. Keep creating. Keep resisting. You're the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray. Love, Grandma." I sat down at that machine and cried until I had no tears left. Then I picked up a piece of fabric and began to sew. The first week after the will reading passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. I'd taken emergency leave from my job in Atlanta, explaining to my boss that my grandmother had died and left me property that needed immediate attention. What I didn't tell her was that immediate attention mostly meant sitting in rooms and crying, or staring at walls and trying to comprehend that this house, this physical manifestation of my grandmother's love and legacy, was actually mine. Vanessa had packed up and left within 3 days, far sooner than the 60 days I'd given her. She'd hired movers and cleared out the guest room in grim silence, refusing to speak to me or even acknowledge my presence when our paths crossed in the hallway. On her last day, I'd found her standing in the living room, looking around with an expression that was equal parts grief and rage. "You know she played us all," Vanessa had said without looking at me. "That whole theatrical will reading, making us show ourselves, judging us, setting us up to fail. That's not love. That's manipulation." Or maybe, I'd replied, it was the last lesson. Maybe she was teaching us that consequences exist even inside families, that you can't treat people poorly and still expect their blessings. She'd laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Keep telling yourself that when you're sitting in this big house all alone, Aisha. Keep telling yourself you earn this when what you really did was stay away just enough to seem noble." I was here, in the trenches, dealing with her medication schedules and her doctor's appointments and her middle-of-the-night fears. You got to be the perfect granddaughter who swooped in occasionally, all smiles and phone calls. I got to be the help. The words had stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I had stayed away. I had built a life elsewhere. But the difference, the crucial difference, was intention. Vanessa had been here for herself, and Grandma had known it. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I'd said finally. "I really do. I hope you find something that fills whatever emptiness makes you need to keep score of love." She'd left without responding, and I hadn't heard from her since. But I'd heard from plenty of other people. The house phone, which I'd kept connected because Grandma had kept it, rang constantly those first few days. Church ladies wanting to know if I needed anything, neighbors I barely remembered stopping by with casseroles and condolences, Mrs. Chen coming over every afternoon with tea and stories about Grandma, sitting on the porch like they'd done for 40 years. She was so proud of you, Mrs. Chen told me on the 4th day, her weathered hands wrapped around a teacup, always talking about your work in Atlanta, how you helped young people find their way. She said you were proof that good people still existed. I miss her so much, I'd whispered, and Mrs. Chen had patted my hand. She's still here, honey, in this house, in you, in everything she taught you. The dead don't leave us, they just change form. On the 5th day, I'd called my job and asked for a month's leave instead of a week. My boss, a woman who'd always been generous with me, had agreed immediately. Take what you need, she'd said. Family stuff is never simple. On the 6th day, I'd started going through Grandma's papers. Mr. Green had left me with boxes of documents, deeds, tax records, business licenses, bank statements. The trust account he'd mentioned was real, accumulated slowly over 50 years. $5 here, $20 there, invested conservatively but consistently. The commercial property on Broughton Street was leased to an arts collective for below-market rent, a decision Grandma had made deliberately. Artists need space to create, she'd written in a note attached to the lease. And creation is how we stay free. The house itself was paid off, had been for 30 years. The property taxes were current. Everything was in order, meticulously maintained, because that was who Grandma was. Organized, intentional, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But the most significant discovery came on the 7th day, when I'd finally worked up the courage to go through Grandma's bedroom thoroughly. In the back of her closet, in a box labeled Aisha's Summers, I found photographs I'd never seen. Me at 7, sitting at the sewing machine for the first time, my face scrunched in concentration. Me at 10, helping Grandma in her garden, both of us covered in dirt and laughing. Me at 13, awkward and uncertain, Grandma's arm around my shoulders, her expression fierce with love. Me at 16, wearing the first dress I'd ever made from scratch, Grandma standing beside me with pride radiating from every line of her body. There were dozens of them, chronicling every summer, every visit, every moment she'd considered worth preserving. And tucked between the photographs were letters she'd written but never sent, addressed to me over the years. My hands shook as I opened the first one. Dated from 15 years ago. Dearest Aisha, you called today to tell me about your new job. I could hear the happiness in your voice, the pride. You've built something real up there in Atlanta, something that matters. I'm so glad you got out of Savannah, got away from this family and their small thinking. You needed space to grow into who you were meant to be, and you took it. That's courage, baby. That's strength. Never let anyone make you feel guilty for saving yourself. I pressed the letter to my chest, crying again, understanding now that she'd always known. She'd always understood why I stayed away, why I built a life elsewhere, why I needed distance to breathe. The other letters chronicled her observations of the family, her growing understanding of the dynamics at play, her careful planning for how to handle her estate. One letter, dated from just 6 months ago, explained everything. I'm dying, and I know it. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe 8. So I'm making plans. I'm making sure that what I've built goes to the right hands. The family won't understand. They'll think I'm being cruel or playing favorites. But I'm being truthful. I'm giving people what they've earned. Vanessa earned money. She needs it, and she worked for it in her way, even if her motives weren't pure. The others earned their bequest too. But you, my darling girl, you earned legacy. You earned the weight of our history and the responsibility of our future. You earned it by being true when truth was hard. By being kind when kindness wasn't rewarded. By being yourself when everyone else wanted you to be someone else. This house is yours because you understand what it means. The business is yours because you understand why it matters. The trust is yours because I trust you to use it wisely. And if the family can't see that, can't understand that, then they've learned nothing from all my years of trying to teach them. I love you, baby. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I have to leave you to face them alone. But you're strong enough. You've always been strong enough. God don't sleep and neither does justice. Your loving Grandma. I sat on her bedroom floor surrounded by photographs and letters, understanding finally the full scope of what she'd done. This wasn't just about property or money. This was about validation. This was about a woman who'd spent her entire life fighting to be seen and respected, making absolutely certain that her granddaughter, who'd faced the same battles, knew she was seen, respected and loved without condition. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reverie. I wiped my face and went downstairs, expecting another neighbor with another casserole. Instead, I found my mother standing on the porch, holding a small suitcase. "I know I should have called first," she said, her voice uncertain. "But I was hoping maybe I could stay for a few days, help you sort through things, or just be here, if you want me here." I looked at her. This woman who'd failed me in so many ways, but who was trying finally to do better. The easy thing would be to send her away, to hold on to the hurt, to make her feel the exclusion I'd felt for so many years. But that wasn't who Grandma had raised me to be. "Come in, Mom," I said, stepping aside. "I could use the company," her face transformed with relief and gratitude. As she stepped into the house, setting her suitcase by the stairs, she looked around with new eyes, not the eyes of someone calculating value, but the eyes of someone remembering. "I grew up in this house," she said softly. "Had my first kiss on that porch, learned to cook in that kitchen, fought with Mama at that dining table about boys and curfews and what I wanted to be when I grew up." She turned to me, tears sliding down her cheeks. "And I let my daughter be hurt in this house because I was too afraid to fight for her. I let this place that should have been safe become a place where you felt invisible. I'm so sorry, Aisha. I know I've said it before, but I need you to really hear it. I am so sorry. I know, Mom, and I did." I could see the genuineness of her regret, the weight of her guilt. "I know. Can I help? With the sorting, the organizing, whatever you need?" I thought about it. About what Grandma would want. About what I needed. "Yeah," I said finally. "Yeah, you can help. But first, come upstairs. I want to show you something." I led her to Grandma's room and showed her the box of photographs and letters. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the floor, looking through memories, crying together, laughing together, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. And for the first time since Grandma died, I felt like maybe, just maybe, something good could come from the wreckage. 3 weeks after the will reading, I finally worked up the courage to visit the commercial property on Broughton Street. Mr. Green had given me the keys and the lease documents, but I'd been putting it off, overwhelmed by everything else. The house alone felt like more than I could handle. Every room held memories. Every corner required decisions about what to keep, what to donate, what to transform. My mother had stayed for 10 days before returning to her own life, but something had shifted between us during that time. We'd talked, really talked, in ways we never had before. She'd told me about her own childhood, about how Grandma had been fierce and loving but also exacting, how my mother had spent her whole life trying to meet impossible standards while also resenting them. She'd talked about her fears, about how she'd seen me struggling to fit in and hadn't known how to help because she was still struggling. Herself, I thought if I just kept the peace, she'd said one night as we sorted through old photographs, everything would work out. I thought if I didn't make waves, you'd find your way. But what I didn't understand was that keeping peace isn't the same as making peace. One is passive, the other is active. One lets harm continue, the other stops it. "You're making peace now," I'd told her, and she'd squeezed my hand. Before she left, she'd helped me start clearing out some of Grandma's clothes. Not all of them, but the everyday things she wouldn't have wanted preserved. We'd kept the special pieces, the dress she'd worn to my graduation, the church suits she'd sewn herself, the collection of head wraps in every color imaginable. Those would stay, at least for now. Everything else went to Mother Bethel's clothing ministry, where they'd go to people who needed them. Now, standing in front of 89 Broughton Street, I understood why Grandma had loved this building. It was old brick, 3 stories with big windows that let in floods of natural light. The ground floor was gallery space, currently displaying an exhibition of local Black artists. The second floor housed studios. The third floor was a community room for workshops and classes. A woman emerged from the front door as I stood there staring. She was in her 50s, with silver locks and paint-stained overalls, carrying a canvas. "You must be Aisha," she said, breaking into a warm smile. "I'm Patricia Mills, Trish. I run the collective. Mrs. Johnson talked about you all the time." "Dr. Mills," I said, recognizing the name. "You were one of the witnesses to her will." I was. She was a dear friend, and not just because she gave us this space at a rent we could actually afford. Trish set down her canvas and pulled me into a hug. Come on, let me show you what we've built here. What she made possible. The gallery was stunning. White walls, polished concrete floors, track lighting illuminating powerful pieces. I recognized several of the artists from Savannah's growing arts scene. Their work ranged from traditional portraiture to abstract expression, but all of it had something in common: a sense of authenticity, of truth-telling, of refusing to compromise vision for palatability. Your grandmother understood something most people don't, Trish said as we walked through the space. She understood that art isn't decoration. It's documentation. It's resistance. It's how we tell our own stories when the world tries to tell them for us. When she offered us this building 5 years ago, she said, "Use it to tell the truth. That's all I ask. Just tell the truth." We climbed the stairs to the second floor, where I met artists working in various mediums: painters, sculptors, textile artists, photographers. Every single one of them had a story about Grandma. How she'd visited their studios, how she'd bought their work, how she'd connected them with opportunities, how she'd believed in them when no one else did. She bought my first piece, a young photographer told me, showing me a series of portraits documenting Savannah's Geechee community. Nobody else thought it would sell. She said it didn't matter if it sold. It mattered that it existed. That somebody needed to see themselves in that work. She paid me enough that I could afford to keep shooting for 6 more months while I built my career. The third floor was filled with teenagers, a workshop on printmaking happening in one corner, a poetry slam practice in another. Trish explained that they offered free after-school programs for kids from the neighborhood, teaching them various art forms, giving them space to express themselves. Your grandmother funded most of these programs, Trish said. She never wanted recognition for it. In fact, she specifically asked us not to name anything after her. She said, "This isn't about me. This is about them. Give them space to find themselves." I felt the weight of it settling on me again. Not just property, but purpose. Grandma hadn't just left me buildings. She'd left me responsibility. She'd left me a living legacy that required tending, nurturing, continuing. What happens now? I asked Trish. With the property, I mean. I honestly don't know what I'm doing. She smiled gently. Neither did your grandmother when she started. She just knew it mattered. She knew that Black artists needed space, that the community needed beauty, that young people needed somewhere to discover themselves. Everything else she figured out as she went. We sat in the community room, drinking tea she'd made in the small kitchenette, and Trish told me more about Grandma's vision. How she'd bought this building 30 years ago for almost nothing, because it was run down and in a neighborhood nobody wanted. How she'd slowly renovated it, doing what she could afford each year. How she'd sewn cushions for all the chairs, made curtains for the windows, created a space that felt like home. She believed in making room, Trish said. That was her philosophy. Make room for people to be themselves. Make room for truth. Make room for beauty. Make room for the next generation to discover what the last generation learned. She looked at me thoughtfully. You're a social worker, right? Working with at-risk youth? I am, in Atlanta. Then you understand what this place does. You understand why it matters. I did. I'd spent 5 years working with teenagers who'd been written off by everyone else. Kids from broken homes, kids in the foster system, kids who'd made mistakes and were trying to find their way back. I'd seen what happened when they had space to express themselves, when someone believed in them, when they were given tools to create instead of destroy. What if I don't live in Savannah? I asked. What if I can't be here to manage this? Your grandmother wasn't here every day either, Trish said. She trusted people. She hired good people, supported them, and let them do their work. That's the model. You don't have to manage everything yourself. You just have to care and make sure it continues. The rest we can figure out together. Over the next few hours, Trish introduced me to the business side of the operation. The collective was officially a nonprofit, with Trish as executive director and a small board of community members. The rent they paid my grandmother, and would now pay me, covered the building's expenses, taxes, insurance, basic maintenance. Grandma had also created a small endowment that funded the youth programs. Everything was organized, documented, sustainable. She thought of everything, I murmured, looking through the financial records. She thought of you, Trish corrected. She set this up so you could continue it without it being a burden. So you could honor her vision without having to sacrifice your own life. She paused. Did you know she came to one of my art shows last year? She was so sick by then, could barely walk. But she came, looked at every single piece, and then she pulled me aside. She said, I'm leaving this building to my granddaughter. Her name is Aisha. When I'm gone, I want you to help her understand what we've built here. Help her see that legacy isn't just about preserving the past. It's about making space for the future. She knew exactly what she was doing. 2 months after Grandma's death, I stood in the sewing room surrounded by fabric, thread, and possibility. The quilt I'd started that first night had grown, a sprawling work of interlocking circles in purples, golds, deep blues, and vibrant greens. The pattern was called Generations, the same one Grandma had been working on when she got too sick to finish. I'd found her incomplete version in a chest and decided to complete it, then create my own version alongside it. Old and new, past and future, her vision and mine, intertwined. I'd made a decision, finally, about my future. I'd given notice at my job in Atlanta, much to my boss's disappointment and understanding. You have to follow what calls you, she'd said. I get it, but you'll be missed. I'd found a similar position in Savannah, a smaller nonprofit working with at-risk youth, exactly the kind of work I loved. The pay was less, but I owned my home outright now. I had rental income from the commercial property. I had the trust fund, which I'd decided to use primarily to expand the arts programs at the collective, the way Grandma would have wanted. I was moving home, not back, because this felt different. Not like returning to a place I'd fled, but choosing a place I wanted to be. Claiming space that was mine, continuing work that mattered, becoming the woman Grandma had always seen in me. The house itself had slowly transformed. I'd kept most of Grandma's furniture, the pieces that held memory and meaning. But I'd also added my own touches. Plants in every window, books on every surface, photographs that told the story of who I was becoming, not just who I'd been. Vanessa's ghost had been exorcised from the guest room, which I'd converted into an office. The sewing room remained sacred, but I'd added my own equipment, my own projects, my own vision. My mother visited every other weekend now, and something beautiful was emerging between us. She'd started therapy. Better late than never, she'd said wryly, and was working through her own guilt and regret. We'd had hard conversations, painful conversations, but also healing ones. She'd told me about her own dreams that she'd set aside, her own compromises that had seemed necessary at the time, her own struggles to find her voice in a family that valued compliance over authenticity. I'm trying to figure out who I am outside of everyone else's expectations, she'd told me during her last visit. At 58 years old, I'm finally asking myself what I want, what I believe, who I am when nobody's watching. Better late than never, right? Much better, I'd said, squeezing her hand. Even some of my cousins had reached out tentatively. Marcus had called to apologize for his silence during the will reading, for not speaking up when the family mocked me. I was a coward, he'd said. I didn't want to make waves, but Grandma was right about you. She was always right about you. Shauna had sent a long email expressing similar sentiments, ending with, I want to do better. Can we try? I'd said yes to both of them. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but it meant making room for people to grow, to change, to become better versions of themselves. That's what Grandma had always done. She'd seen people as they were and as they could be, held space for both truths simultaneously. Vanessa was the only one I hadn't heard from. Through the family grapevine, I'd learned she'd moved to Charleston, started over, was rebuilding her real estate career. Part of me hoped she'd find whatever she was looking for. Part of me knew we'd probably never reconcile, and that was okay too. Some relationships were meant to be lessons, not lifelong connections. The commercial building on Broughton Street had become my second home. I visited twice a week, attending gallery openings, sitting in on workshops, getting to know the artists and the young people who came through the programs. Trish had become a mentor and friend, teaching me about arts administration, about fundraising, about the delicate balance between preserving vision and adapting to change. We'd expanded the youth programs, adding a scholarship fund for talented students who wanted to pursue art professionally. We'd partnered with local schools to bring arts education to kids who wouldn't otherwise have access. We'd started a mentorship program connecting established artists with emerging ones. All of it funded by Grandma's trust, by careful budgeting, by my own fundraising efforts. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Trish told me regularly. "You've honored her vision while making it your own." That's exactly what legacy should look like. But the most profound change had been internal. I'd spent so much of my life feeling invisible, fighting to be seen, questioning my worth. Grandma's will had forced me to confront the truth. I had always been worthy. I had always been enough. The problem had never been me. It had been a family too small-minded to recognize the value standing right in front of them. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had Grandma's validation, given not just in words but in action, in the house, the building, the trust, the legacy. I had my own validation, earned through years of showing up, doing the work, staying true. That was enough. That was more than enough. One Saturday afternoon in early October, almost 4 months after Grandma's death, I was working in the garden, planting bulbs for spring, the way she'd always done. Mrs. Chen came over with lemonade and settled into one of the porch chairs. "You've brought this place back to life," she observed. It was getting sad there for a while before Evelyn passed, but now it feels like it's breathing again. "It feels like home," I said, brushing dirt from my hands. "Finally. That's because you're not running anymore. You're standing still, putting down roots, letting yourself belong." She sipped her lemonade thoughtfully. Evelyn used to say that belonging wasn't about fitting in. It was about finding a place where you could be yourself and call it home. Looks like you found it. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of purple and gold, Grandma's colors, always Grandma's colors, I sat on the porch with the completed quilt in my lap. I'd finished it that afternoon, the final stitches pulled tight, the binding sewn with care. It was beautiful. Traditional pattern made contemporary through color choices and fabric selection. Old wisdom expressed in new language. I decided to donate Grandma's completed Generations quilt to Mother Bethel, where it would hang in the fellowship hall as a reminder of her service and love. But this one, my version, my creation, my testimony, this one would stay here, draped over the back of her favorite chair, a living connection between past and present. Inside the house, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail, content to sit in the golden hour and simply be. When I checked it later, I found a message from Mr. Green. "Miss Johnson, all the paperwork is finalized. Everything is officially transferred. The house, the building, the trust. It's all legally yours now. Your grandmother's legacy is in your hands. Use it well." I saved the message, knowing I'd want to hear his voice again sometime. That formal confirmation that I'd been entrusted with something precious. In the sewing room, I'd hung not just Grandma's final letter, but also photographs from throughout her life. As a young woman starting her business, as a mother raising her children, as a grandmother teaching me to sew, as an elder woman still fighting, still creating, still refusing to be diminished. And beside those photographs, I'd hung one of myself, taken just last week by one of the photographers at the collective. In it, I'm standing in front of the building on Broughton Street, the sun behind me, my face serious but content, my natural hair framing my face like a crown, my dark skin glowing in the light. I looked at those photographs, her life and mine, her journey and mine, her legacy and mine, and I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me all along. Legacy isn't about buildings or bank accounts or property deeds. Those are just tools, just vehicles for something deeper. Legacy is about the truth you tell with your life. It's about the space you make for others to tell their truths. It's about refusing to be smaller than you are, refusing to accept less than you deserve, refusing to disappear when the world wants you gone. Legacy is resistance made tangible. It's love made visible. It's justice delayed but ultimately delivered. I thought about that first will reading, about sitting in the corner invisible while they laughed at my exclusion. I thought about the second envelope, about the shocked silence as Grandma's truth emerged. I thought about Vanessa's rage, my mother's tears, the family's collective realization that they'd revealed themselves and been found wanting. And I understood now that Grandma's final lesson wasn't just for me, it was for all of us. She'd shown the family what they'd become, given them a mirror to see their own smallness. She'd shown me what I'd always been, given me validation I'd been seeking my whole life. She'd shown everyone that truth has its own timing, that justice isn't always immediate, but it is inevitable. That love, real love, sees everything and chooses deliberately. In the gathering darkness, I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. I'd been recording my thoughts occasionally, documenting this journey, creating my own archive for whatever came next. I hit record. "It's been 4 months since Grandma died," I said softly. 4 months since the will reading, since the second envelope, since my life changed completely. I'm sitting on her porch, my porch now, and I'm thinking about something she used to say. "God don't sleep, baby." I never really understood what she meant until now. She meant that truth is patient but persistent, that justice might be slow but it's certain, that love, real, unconditional, sees you for who you really are, love, that love doesn't forget or fail or fade. It just waits for the right moment to reveal itself. I inherited a house, a building, a trust fund, but what I really inherited was a message. You are worthy. You are seen. You are loved exactly as you are, and that message is the greatest legacy anyone could ever leave. So here's my message. To anyone listening, to my future self when I doubt, to the next generation who'll come after me. You don't have to be different than you are. You don't have to shrink or bend or apologize for existing. You just have to be true. Stay true. Keep creating. Make room for others. Tell your truth. That's the legacy. That's the resistance. That's the love. God don't sleep, baby. And neither do we. I stopped recording and looked up at the sky, now deep purple and scattered with early stars. Somewhere in that vast darkness, I felt Grandma's presence. Not gone, just changed. Just transformed into something that lived in me now. In this house, in the work I'd continue, in the love I'd pass forward, I was home. Finally, truly home. And I was exactly where I was meant to be.